We all have individual identities, and we also have group identities, often, if not usually, many. Some photographs are more obvious than others. My mother looks relaxed in her ATS uniform. By contrast, in the other image of a group of young men, my father looks understandably nervous. He has just joined the Royal Artillery. He is 18 years old, and it is 1939. In the group pictures at the bottom of the page are men whose lives and destinies would become entwined with that of my father and his colleagues. My mother joined the Auxiliary Territorial Services, the ATS, and her picture was published in a national daily newspaper, heralding the arrival of trousers for women in the ATS. And Mum, or rather just her head, appeared in the Sunday Pictorial of September the 7th, 1941. Although I suspect she knew little about it, it is my mother who is quoted along with Eve Brent, Britain's champion housewife, who is not the Hollywood actress of the same name, as having jobs for 500,000 women as part of the war effort. Entitled Convoy, a 2-page spread followed. Along British roads rumble lines of lorries which in peace would be driven by husky men. At their wheels today are girls of the ATS, including Sergeant Maddox and her squad. As obvious propaganda, photographs to encourage women to join the war effort. The article concludes with a photograph saying, at the conclusion of the day's duties, Sergeant Maddox gives the order to fall out. Although the squad are certainly doing a man's job, they are far from averse to that feminine solace, a hot cup of tea, to which they are now hastening. This was a far cry from my father's experience. He was captured by the Japanese and spent time at Kwai as a prisoner of war. Kwai is in what was then called Burma, and it was here that the Emperor of Japan built a huge railway between Bangkok in Thailand and Rangoon in Burma to support its forces. Alongside Asian workers, about 60,000 Allied prisoners were forced to work on the railway. Thousands died because of the appalling conditions, and about a third of those forced to work on the line lost their lives. I have about 30 photographs taken at that time. They belonged to Dad, and I found them after he died tucked away in a brown paper bag. He never spoke of them. Consequently, I knew very little about them, and have had to find out as much as possible to ensure that I can publish them. As a result, I have now sent them to the National Archives of Singapore for them to be used for educational purposes. These are examples of photographs that speak for themselves. In 2011, my daughter and her boyfriend travelled to Kanchanaburi and Kwai. Madeline took many photographs of the places where her grandfather had worked as a POW all those years before. I know it was an emotional and personal experience for her. It has also been helpful for me as I have been able to visit from afar through her and with her photography. Madeline was only 3 years old when her grandfather died. As such, she may not remember much about him. But by looking at photographs of the two of them together, taken over 20 years ago, she recognises the connection between them. Because of my own family history, the shadows cast by the Second World War have always loomed large. When I was in France, living in Alençon, I often visited the Normandy beaches that played such a big part during the Second World War. This is one of the Allies' boats that crossed the English Channel on the 6th of June 1944. When in 1990 I visited one of the beaches where the landings had taken place, this boat was still there, completely isolated in a massive space. The coastline of Normandy is consecrated to the memory of the events that marked the beginning of the end of the German occupation of France and ultimately the Second World War. Years after my time living in Normandy, I learnt that my family had acquired a connection to the wartime events in France. My brother-in-law's Jack's father, Air Chief Marshal Sir Ronald Ivor Lord Chapman, known as Chaps, had been involved in a bombing raid over German-occupied France. Jack, who had served in the forces himself and become an antique dealer and auctioneer, would eventually write a book about this and his father's other RAF experiences. Years after Sir Ronald Ivor Lord Chapman's death, in 1989, I met Pierre Blanchon. Aged 83 then, he remembered Chaps as very tall, very English and very distinguished. He confirmed how badly he had been hurt and said that because he was so tall, when they dressed him in the garb of a French peasant, the trousers reached only to his knees and the only shoes that would fit were slippers. Consequently, it was quite hard to camouflage him. I was lucky to be able to correspond with a lady whose code name was Gilberte. In his own biographical notes, Chaps had written, "After the restricted life of the previous 3 weeks, we felt as free as air, as we whistled as we rode to a nearby village where we had been bidden to call at a local baker's shop and remark casually that we cherched Gilberte. This we duly did, and were promptly taken into a back parlour, where we met one of the bravest French women it has ever been my privilege to know.